The True War Encounters, Desmond Doss. They believed bullets decide survival. He chose compassion and saved 16. The rope didn't look like it could hold a man's weight. That was the first thing Desmond Doss thought when he saw it tied to the charred stump at the lip of Hacksaw Ridge. Just a single cargo line, already frayed in 2 places, disappearing over the cliff edge into smoke and darkness below. Above him, the plateau stretched like a moonscape of shell craters and shattered coral, and somewhere in that wasteland, wounded men were calling for help. Somewhere in that chaos, American soldiers were dying because no one would go back up. The morning assault on the ridge had been a disaster. The 77th Infantry Division had thrown everything at the escarpment, waves of riflemen scrambling up rope ladders and cargo nets, only to be shredded by machine gun fire from concealed Japanese positions. By noon, half the company was pinned down on top with no way to retreat. By mid-afternoon, the order came to pull back and regroup. But pulling back meant leaving men behind. Wounded men, men who couldn't climb down on their own. Doss stood at the base of the cliff with mud caking his boots and exhaustion pressing down on his shoulders like a physical weight. Around him, soldiers slumped against rocks and tree stumps, their faces blank with shock. The medical officer was organizing triage for the men who'd made it down, but the screaming from above hadn't stopped. It echoed off the coral face of the ridge, high, desperate, impossible to ignore. "We can't go back up there," a corporal said, his voice flat. "They'll kill anyone who shows their head over that edge." Doss looked at the rope again. Then he looked at the cliff. 400 feet of sheer rock and mud. At the top, the plateau where the wounded lay, scattered like broken dolls across cratered ground. He thought about the men calling for help, about the promise he'd made when he enlisted, to save lives, not take them, about the weight of his medical bag and the lightness of having no rifle. "I'm going up," he said quietly. The corporal stared at him. "You're out of your mind." "Maybe. Probably." But Doss was already checking the rope, testing its strength with trembling hands. His fingers found the frayed sections, places where shrapnel or heat had weakened the fibers. He'd have to be careful lowering men on this line. Careful and lucky. He whispered a prayer under his breath, something about strength and guidance, then grabbed the rope and started climbing. The ascent took 20 minutes of hand-over-hand pulling, boots scrabbling for purchase on wet rock. Halfway up, mortar rounds started walking across the ridgeline above, sending geysers of dirt and coral into the air. Doss pressed himself flat against the cliff face, feeling the shock waves through the stone, and counted seconds between explosions. When the barrage shifted east, he kept climbing. At the top, he pulled himself over the edge and into hell. The plateau was a killing field, cratered earth, broken trees, the smell of smoke and something worse underneath. Bodies lay scattered in the open. Some moved, some didn't, and from the foxholes and shell craters came the voices. "Medic, medic, please." Doss crouched low and scanned the ground. 50 yards to his left, movement. A soldier dragging himself toward cover with one leg trailing uselessly behind him. Doss ran in a low crouch, zigzagging between craters, and dropped beside the man. Shrapnel wound to the thigh, bleeding badly. He worked fast, tourniquet, pressure dressing, morphine. The whole time, bullets snapped overhead like angry insects. "Can you walk?" Doss asked. "No." "Then I'm dragging you." It took 15 minutes to cover those 50 yards back to the cliff edge. Doss hauled the soldier through mud and over broken coral, stopping every few feet to rest and breathe and pray he wouldn't take a round in the back. When they reached the rope, he fashioned a harness from rifle slings and his own belt, secured it around the wounded man's chest, and signaled to the soldiers below. Then he watched as the man disappeared over the edge, lowering jerk by jerk into safety. 1. Doss turned and looked back across the plateau, more voices, more wounded. He counted silently in his head, trying to guess how many men were still up here, trying to calculate whether his body could last long enough to get them all down. The rope swayed in the wind, fraying a little more with each descent. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The second man was easier to find, but harder to save. He'd taken a bullet through the shoulder and was going into shock, his skin pale and clammy, his eyes unfocused. Doss knelt beside him in a shallow crater on the Okinawa Plateau and worked by feel more than sight. The smoke was too thick to see clearly, and the constant rattle of machine gun fire made thinking nearly impossible. He packed the wound with sulfur powder, wrapped it tight with field dressings, and injected morphine with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Stay with me," Doss said. "We're getting you down." The man's eyes focused on him for a moment. "You're the medic who won't carry a gun." "That's right." "You're crazy." Doss almost smiled. He'd heard that before, from other soldiers, from officers, from his own family back in Virginia. When he'd enlisted as a conscientious objector, requesting combat medic duty without a weapon, they'd called him a coward. When he'd made it through basic training despite the harassment and the beatings, they'd called him stubborn. When he'd volunteered for the 77th Infantry Division heading to the Pacific, they'd stopped calling him anything and just watched to see if he'd survive. Now, here he was, dragging another wounded soldier across the most dangerous piece of ground on Hacksaw Ridge, while men with rifles cowered in foxholes. The drag back to the cliff took longer this time. Japanese mortars had zeroed in on the rope line, and Doss had to wait out 3 separate barrages, lying flat with the wounded man pressed into the mud beside him. Between explosions, he moved. 10 feet, rest. Another 10 feet, rest. His arms burned, his legs were cramping, but the cliff edge was getting closer. When they reached the rope, Doss took extra time checking the harness. The frayed sections had gotten worse, more fibers separating under the strain. He'd need to be more careful, lower men more slowly. He signaled to the men below and watched as the soldier descended, the rope creaking ominously with each foot of drop. 2. Down at the aid station below the ridge, a young medical officer named Lieutenant Brennan was losing count of the wounded arriving from above. They came down the rope one at a time, each descent announced by a sharp whistle from the ridge. Brennan and his corpsmen would catch them, cut the makeshift harnesses, and carry them to triage. Most were in bad shape. Shrapnel wounds, bullet holes, crushed limbs from cave-ins and explosions. "Where are they coming from?" Brennan asked one of the stretcher-bearers. "Still on top, some medics bringing them down. The medic who won't carry a rifle." "That's the one." Brennan shook his head. He'd heard the stories about Doss, about the Seventh-day Adventist who insisted on keeping the Sabbath and refused to touch a weapon. Most of the officers thought he was a liability. Some thought he was insane. But the numbers didn't lie. Wounded men were coming down that cliff, and someone up there was risking everything to send them. Back on the plateau, Doss found the third man trapped under a collapsed section of bunker timber. It took precious minutes to free him, lifting the beam inch by inch while mortar rounds crept closer. The man's legs were crushed, bones visible through torn fabric. Doss splintered them with shattered wood and strips of uniform, whispering apologies for the pain. Then began another brutal drag to the cliff edge. Halfway there, a Japanese soldier appeared from a spider hole 20 yards ahead. For one frozen moment they stared at each other, the enemy rifleman and the unarmed medic dragging a wounded American. Doss felt his heart stop. His hands went numb. He had no weapon, no defense, just a medical bag and a promise he'd made to save lives. The Japanese soldier raised his rifle. Doss closed his eyes and prayed. The shot never came. When he opened his eyes, the soldier had disappeared back into the hole, melting into the smoke and chaos. Doss didn't understand it, didn't try to. He just kept dragging. 3. By the time he lowered the fourth man, the sun was starting to sink toward the horizon. The ridge would be dark soon, and moving at night under Japanese fire was suicide. But the voices hadn't stopped. Somewhere in the smoke and craters, more men were calling for help. Doss counted them in his head, estimating, guessing. Maybe a dozen left, maybe more. The rope swayed in the evening breeze. Doss grabbed it to steady himself and felt the fraying fibers under his torn palms. He didn't know how many more trips it could handle. He didn't know how many more trips his own body could handle. But he knew he couldn't stop yet. By the sixth man, Doss wasn't counting anymore. He was just moving. One wounded soldier to the next, one crater to the next shell hole, one drag across the shattered coral of Hacksaw Ridge to the fraying rope that might or might not hold. His medical bag was nearly empty. His hands were shredded, rope burns layered over rope burns, blood from a dozen different soldiers mixing with his own. Every muscle screamed for rest. But the voices kept calling from the smoke, and Doss kept answering. The sixth man had taken shrapnel across his back and couldn't feel his legs. Doss found him in a foxhole, whispering the Lord's Prayer to himself, convinced he was dying. Doss worked fast, checking for spinal damage, immobilizing him as best he could with salvaged equipment, promising him he'd make it down alive. The promise felt like a lie. The rope was deteriorating with each descent, and darkness was coming to the ridge faster than Doss could move. "How many you got so far?" the wounded man asked, his voice slurred from morphine. "6, Doss said. Then he paused, doing the math in his head. No. 7, counting the one who walked down on his own early on. Or was it 8? The numbers were blurring. He was so tired. "Just get me down," the soldier whispered. "Please." The drag to the cliff edge took everything Doss had left. His legs kept buckling. His vision was tunneling. Twice he had to stop and vomit from exhaustion, crouching in the mud, while his body rebelled against what he was asking it to do. When they finally reached the rope, Doss's hands were shaking so badly he could barely tie the harness knots. 6 or 7. He wasn't sure anymore. Down below the ridge, Lieutenant Brennan was dealing with his own crisis. The aid station was overflowing. Wounded men covered every flat surface, groaning and bleeding while medics rushed between them with inadequate supplies. And still the rope kept delivering more. Brennan had stopped asking where they were coming from. He just caught them, triaged them, and sent the worst cases to the rear. "How's that medic still alive up there?" one of the corpsmen asked. Brennan didn't answer. He was wondering the same thing. On the plateau, Doss found the 8th man, or was it the 9th, bleeding from a gut wound that should have killed him hours ago. The soldier was delirious, calling for his mother, and Doss had to work by feel in the gathering darkness. He packed the wound, administered the last of his morphine, and made a choice that terrified him. He'd have to drag this man in the dark. The Japanese owned the night on Okinawa. Moving after sunset was asking to die. But the alternative was leaving him. Halfway to the rope, Doss heard footsteps behind him. He froze, certain it was a Japanese patrol, but when he turned, he saw an American rifleman emerging from a crater, a corporal from his own company, someone who'd mocked him during training for refusing to carry a weapon. "I'll help," the corporal said quietly. They dragged the wounded man together, moving through darkness punctuated by distant flares and the occasional burst of machine gun fire. When they reached the cliff edge, the corporal helped secure the harness, checked the rope, and signaled to the men below. As the wounded soldier descended into darkness, the corporal turned to Doss. "How many more up here?" Doss looked back across the plateau. Flares were bursting in the distance, briefly illuminating the cratered ground. He could hear voices. Maybe 4 more, maybe 5, maybe more he hadn't found yet. His mind was too foggy to be sure. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm going back. You'll die up here. Maybe." The corporal stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded and disappeared back into the darkness. Doss stood alone at the cliff edge, looking at the rope. Even in the dim light, he could see how badly it was fraying. Another 4 or 5 descents and it would fail. He needed to choose, take the remaining wounded down carefully one at a time and risk running out of rope, or try to move faster and risk the line snapping under the strain. He closed his eyes and prayed. "Lord, just tell me how many. Give me a number I can hold on to." In his exhaustion and fear, a number came to him. Not a voice, not a vision, just a quiet certainty settling into his chest like a stone. 16. He could save 16 before his body gave out, 16 before the rope failed, 16 before God stopped protecting him on this ridge. He opened his eyes and did the math. If he'd already brought down 8 or 9, that meant 7 or 8 more. 7 or 8 more trips across killing ground in the dark, 7 or 8 more men lowered on a rope that was already dying. Doss took a breath, adjusted his nearly empty medical bag, and turned back toward the screaming. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The 10th man nearly killed them both. Doss found him in a collapsed cave entrance on the northern edge of the Hacksaw Ridge Plateau, both legs shattered by a cave-in, pinned under rocks and timber. It took 20 minutes to dig him out, 20 minutes of exposed, vulnerable work, while Japanese positions less than 100 yards away could have opened fire at any moment. Doss's hands bled freely now, the skin torn away in places, but he kept digging, kept pulling debris aside, kept whispering reassurances to the trapped soldier who was convinced he was already dead. When they finally got him free and started the drag back to the rope, Doss realized he'd lost track of the count. Was this the 10th? The 11th? His mind was fragmenting from exhaustion, thoughts scattering like smoke. All he knew for certain was the number 16, still burning in his chest like a promise or a prayer. 16 lives. That's what he'd been given to save. He just had to get there. The rope creaked ominously when this man went down. Doss heard fibers snapping, felt the line shift and settle in a way that made his stomach drop. He crouched at the cliff edge and ran his torn hands along the length he could reach. Multiple weak points now. The rope was dying, strand by strand. He went back. The 11th and 12th men came as a pair, 2 soldiers who'd crawled into the same crater and couldn't move. One had a shattered arm. The other had shrapnel across his back and couldn't feel anything below his waist. Doss treated them both in darkness, working by touch and memory, then faced the terrible mathematics of rescue. He could only take one at a time, which meant promising one man he'd return, then dragging the other across the plateau while praying the promise wouldn't become a lie. "I'm coming back for you," Doss said to the paralyzed soldier. "On my life, I'm coming back." The man with the shattered arm went down first. 11, or was it 12? Doss was losing the sequence, holding on to only the final number. 16. He checked the rope again. Worse. Definitely worse. Maybe 3 or 4 more descents before it failed completely. He climbed back up and returned for the paralyzed soldier, dragging him across ground that felt infinite in the darkness. When they reached the cliff edge, the man grabbed Doss's wrist with desperate strength. "Thank you," he whispered. Doss couldn't speak. He just nodded and lowered him into the darkness. 12 or 13. He'd lost count entirely now, was operating on nothing but the certainty of 16 burning in his chest like a beacon. Back at the aid station, Lieutenant Brennan had stopped trying to understand. The wounded kept coming down that rope, one after another through the night, each one carried by a line that should have failed hours ago. His medics were exhausted, supplies nearly gone, but they kept catching the men as they descended, kept cutting the harnesses, kept carrying them to triage. Brennan stood in the darkness and watched the rope sway, wondering if the medic up there was even human anymore, or if he'd become something else, some kind of stubborn angel refusing to quit until every last man was saved. On the plateau, Doss found the 14th man, definitely the 14th, he was almost sure, trapped under a fallen tree, both legs crushed, shock setting in, skin cold and clammy. Doss worked fast, splinting with broken branches and torn uniform, injecting the last ampule of morphine from a fallen soldier's gear. The drag to the cliff took 40 minutes. Doss's legs kept giving out. He'd fall, lie in the mud, gasping, then force himself up and drag a few more feet. The wounded man was semi-conscious, murmuring prayers that mixed with Doss's own whispered mantras. When the 14th man went down, the rope screamed. Doss heard it from the cliff edge, a high, tearing sound as multiple strands gave way at once. The descent stopped halfway down. Men below shouted warnings. Doss gripped the rope with his destroyed hands and felt the vibration of imminent failure running through every fiber. The line held barely, but it held. 14, two more, just two more to reach 16. Doss turned back toward the plateau and saw a figure moving toward him through the smoke. The corporal who'd helped earlier, now carrying another wounded soldier across his shoulders. They reached the cliff edge together, and the corporal gently lowered the man to the ground. 15, the corporal said. I counted. You're at 15. Doss stared at him, trying to process the information through the fog of exhaustion. 15. One more to 16. Just one more. There's still voices out there, Doss said. I know. I heard them too. They lowered the 15th man together, both of them gripping the rope, feeling it stretch and groan under the weight. When the tension finally released and they heard the whistle from below, the corporal looked at Doss. One more. One more. They found the 16th man together, a young rifleman trapped in a foxhole, gut wound, bleeding badly. Doss worked on him while the corporal kept watch, and when they lifted him to begin the drag, other soldiers emerged from the darkness. 4 of them. 5. Men who'd been hiding in craters and spider holes, too terrified to move, now coming forward to help carry this last wounded soldier to the cliff edge. They moved as a group through the smoke and darkness, passing the man between them when their strength failed, until they reached the rope one final time. Doss tied the harness with hands that barely functioned anymore, checked the knots twice, then signaled to the men below. The rope groaned, stretched, held. 16. When the 16th man disappeared over the cliff edge, Desmond Doss collapsed. His legs simply stopped working. He fell forward onto his hands and knees in the mud at the edge of Hacksaw Ridge and tried to breathe through the pain radiating from every part of his body. Around him, the soldiers who'd helped carry the last wounded man stood in silence, staring at him like they'd witnessed something they didn't have words for. The corporal knelt beside him. You need to go down now, before the rope fails completely. Doss nodded, but couldn't move. His hands were locked in a claw shape from gripping rope and dragging weight. His legs were cramping so badly he couldn't feel his feet. And somewhere inside his chest, beneath the exhaustion and the pain, something was breaking, not physically, something deeper. Here was the truth that would never make it into the citation or the official reports. Doss hadn't been brave up here. He'd been terrified. Every single trip across that plateau, every drag through the darkness, every moment at the cliff edge lowering men on a dying rope. He'd been certain he was about to die. He'd heard bullets snap past his head close enough to feel the heat. He'd felt mortars land so close the concussion lifted him off the ground. He'd crossed open ground that should have been his grave a dozen times over, and the only reason he'd kept moving was because stopping felt like a worse death. Stopping meant hearing those voices calling medic and choosing not to answer. Stopping meant lying in a foxhole while men bled out in the darkness. Stopping meant living with himself after, and that had seemed impossible. The number 16 hadn't been divine inspiration, it had been desperation. A drowning man grabbing for something concrete to hold on to before he went under. How many can I save before I break, before the rope fails, before my body quits or my faith shatters or the Japanese finally put a bullet where it counts? 16 had been his answer to himself, his deal with God or fate or whatever was keeping him alive on this ridge. Just get me to 16 and I'll stop. I promise I'll stop. And now here he was at 16, and the voices were still calling from the plateau. He could hear them even now, faint cries from the darkness, men he hadn't found, men he'd walked past in the smoke. Men dying while he knelt here, shaking and broken. The corporal had said 16, had counted for him. But what if the corporal was wrong? What if there were 17 wounded up here? 18? What if the promise of 16 was just another lie he'd told himself to make the impossible bearable? There's more out there, Doss whispered. You can't, the corporal said firmly. Look at your hands. Look at the rope. It's over. But Doss was already trying to stand. His legs buckled. He fell again. The corporal caught him, held him upright, and for a moment they stood together at the cliff edge on Okinawa, while smoke rolled across the shattered ground behind them. "I promised," Doss said. His voice was breaking. "I promised I'd get them all." "You got 16! That's more than anyone thought possible. That's more than—" "It's not all of them." The words came out as a shout, raw and desperate. The other soldiers nearby turned to look. Doss felt his throat closing up, felt tears mixing with the mud and blood on his face. He was breaking. Right here at the cliff edge, in front of everyone, he was shattering into pieces. The corporal held him steady. "Listen to me. The rope is done. One more trip and it snaps. Maybe it snaps on the way back up. Maybe it snaps while you're lowering the next man and you both fall. You've done enough." "How do you know when enough is enough?" Doss asked. His voice had dropped to a whisper. "How do you ever stop hearing them call for help?" The corporal had no answer. Nobody did. This was the secret that would haunt Doss for the rest of his life. Not that he'd saved 16 men on Hacksaw Ridge, but that he'd stopped at 16 while men were still dying in the darkness. The citation would call it heroism. The Medal of Honor would frame it as extraordinary courage. But Doss would remember it as the night he'd made a deal with his own limitations and prayed it was enough. He let the corporal guide him to the rope. Let other soldiers rig a harness around his chest. Let them lower him over the cliff edge while he stared up at the smoke-stained sky and counted silently in his head. 16. Not 15. Not 17. 16. The number that would live in his bones and wake him from sleep for decades, sometimes as a triumph, sometimes as a condemnation. The descent felt eternal. The rope creaked and groaned, stretching thin, fibers separating under his weight. Halfway down it shifted suddenly, dropping him several feet before catching again. Doss heard men below shouting, felt the line swing against the cliff face. He closed his eyes and prayed, but the prayer had no words anymore, just the number, just 16. When his boots touched ground, medics rushed forward to catch him. Lieutenant Brennan was there, cutting the harness, shouting for stretchers. Doss tried to tell them about the voices still calling from above, but his throat wouldn't work. He tried to stand, to go back up, but his legs folded. The rope, finally relieved of its burden, gave one last groan and snapped. The upper section whipped back up the cliff and disappeared over the edge. The lower section fell in a heap at Brennan's feet. A tangle of frayed hemp and broken dreams of 17 or 18 or however many men Doss hadn't found. Someone draped a blanket over Doss's shoulders. Someone else pressed a canteen to his lips. He drank without tasting, stared at nothing without seeing, and counted silently in his head. 16. The after-action report from Hacksaw Ridge was filed 3 days later in a rear area command post on Okinawa, typed on clean paper by an officer who hadn't been on the plateau that night. It noted the failed assault, the tactical withdrawal, and, almost as an afterthought, the evacuation of 16 wounded personnel by PFC. Desmond Doss, combat medic, 77th Infantry Division. The report used words like extraordinary and heroic and above and beyond. It said nothing about the rope that failed, or the voices that kept calling after 16, or the way Doss's hands had to be soaked in warm water for an hour before the medics could unwrap the field dressings covering his torn palms. Lieutenant Brennan wrote a separate report recommending Doss for the Medal of Honor. He described the rope, the darkness, the impossible number of trips across killing ground. He tried to capture what it had meant to stand at the bottom of that cliff and watch wounded men descend from hell one after another, each one carried by a medic who should have been dead a dozen times over. But words felt inadequate. How do you explain watching someone refuse to quit when quitting was the only rational choice? The corporal who'd helped with the last man wrote nothing. He went back to his squad, cleaned his rifle, and told nobody what he'd seen. Years later, when reporters asked him about that night, he'd say only that Doss had saved 16 and leave it at that. Some truths were too heavy to share. Doss spent 4 days in the field hospital before they'd let him return to his unit. His hands were bandaged. His body was a map of bruises and rope burns. But the worst wounds were invisible. The ones that would wake him in the middle of the night for the next 50 years, hearing voices call "medic" from darkness he could never quite reach. The official ceremony came months later, after Okinawa fell and the war moved toward its terrible conclusion. President Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Doss's neck in a White House ceremony, and photographers captured the moment for newspapers across America. The citations spoke of courage and faith. They mentioned 16 men saved. They said nothing about 17 or the weight of stopping when stopping felt like failure. Doss smiled for the cameras and shook hands with officers and accepted congratulations from men who called him a hero. And every time someone said the number 16, he felt something twist inside his chest. Pride and guilt tangled together so tightly he couldn't separate them anymore. 3 decades later, Doss was trimming hedges in his backyard in Georgia when a summer thunderstorm rolled in. The first drops hit the leaves with a sound like distant small arms fire. The smell of wet earth rose up around him, and suddenly he was back on the ridge, mud under his knees, rope fibers cutting into his palms, voices calling from the smoke. He stood very still until the moment passed. His wife found him there, shears dangling from one hand, staring at nothing, while rain soaked through his shirt. She knew better than to ask. After 30 years of marriage, she understood that some days the ridge came back, triggered by smells or sounds or the particular quality of dusk light. Some days her husband was somewhere else, counting silently to 16. That night, their grandson visited for dinner. The boy was studying World War II in school and asked Doss about the Medal of Honor. Doss gave his standard answer, brief, factual, stripped of emotion. He mentioned the ridge, the rope, the wounded. He said he'd helped get some men down. "How many?" the grandson asked. 16. "Wow, that's amazing." Doss looked at the boy across the dinner table, looked at this young life that had never heard artillery or felt coral dust in his lungs or made terrible deals with God about where to stop when stopping meant leaving men behind. And he thought about all the stories that couldn't be told, all the truths that were too complicated for citations or textbooks or dinner table conversations. The legend said he'd saved 16 men through faith and courage. The legend was true, as far as it went. But legends are light, thin layers of meaning that people can carry without being crushed. The real weight lived in the details the legend left out, in the mortar rounds that missed by inches, in the Japanese soldier who'd raised a rifle and chose not to fire, in the moment at the cliff edge when he'd collapsed and wanted to quit but couldn't, because quitting meant living with ghosts, in the voices he still heard sometimes, calling from darkness he couldn't reach. "Were you scared?" the grandson asked. Doss smiled, though it cost him something. Every single minute. That night, long after his wife and grandson had gone to bed, Doss stood at the kitchen window and looked out at his backyard. The storm had passed. Everything was quiet, wet, still. No artillery, no screaming, no rope fraying under impossible weight. Just a summer night in Georgia, peaceful and safe, while somewhere inside his chest the ridge still burned. He counted silently to himself. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 16. Then he whispered a prayer for the ones he hadn't found, for 17 and 18, and however many had died in the darkness, while he'd made his bargain with his limitations and called it faith. The legend would say he'd performed a miracle that night. But Doss knew better. He'd done what he could with what he had, a medical bag, a fraying rope, and a stubborn refusal to stop until his body or his will finally broke. 16 hadn't been a miracle. It had been the exact measure of one man's strength before weakness claimed him, and that, he thought, was both enough and not enough. Forever enough, forever not enough. He turned from the window and walked slowly upstairs. Behind him, the kitchen stood empty and quiet, holding the weight of what medals cannot say and history cannot fully capture, the private cost of being turned into legend while still carrying the human truth inside. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.